She hadn't spoken to anyone outside that house in 8 months. They'd taken her phone, locked the door from the outside, told every person in town that her illness had made her unreliable, confused, a danger to herself, that Derek was doing everything he could. She had 41 years in this community. She'd shaped the minds of half the people in it. Now she sat in the back seat of a grey Volvo at a gas station on Highway 41, and through a 2-inch gap in the window, she watched a man covered in tattoos and leather slow his step beside her door. She had 6 seconds. What she did with them, and what those men found when they came back, was about to destroy everything this town thought it knew. The thing about Millbrook, Tennessee, was that it looked exactly like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. The main street was lined with maple trees that had been there since before anyone living could remember, their roots pressing against the old sidewalk in a way that made every block a small adventure in uneven pavement. The storefronts wore fresh coats of paint in warm blues and creams. The Presbyterian church on the corner of 5th and Magnolia kept its lawn immaculate, regardless of the season, the grass trimmed to a uniform height that suggested both civic pride and a level of dedication that bordered on the devotional. There was a hardware store that had been in the same family for 4 generations, a diner that had been serving the best biscuits in the county for longer than its current owner had been alive, and a post office where the woman behind the counter knew every name on every box without needing to check. It was the kind of town that took great and visible pride in its surfaces. Grace Hartwell had lived in Millbrook for 41 years. She had taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary for 26 of those years, and in a town that size, that meant she had been present at the formation of nearly every adult under the age of 50. The woman who ran the flower shop on Cedar Lane had learned her multiplication tables in Grace's classroom. The young deputy at the sheriff's department had written his first complete paragraph under her watch. The dentist, the hardware store's current owner, the woman who trimmed the church lawn with such precision, most of them carried something of Grace Hartwell inside them, deposited in the years when their minds were still taking their permanent shape. She had been, in every meaningful sense of the word, the kind of person a community is built around without ever fully recognizing it. Now she sat in the 2nd bedroom of the house on Elm Ridge Road, where her son Derek had moved her 14 months ago, watching a thin rectangle of pale November light travel with geological patience across the carpet, and she thought about what it meant to become invisible while still occupying space. The wheelchair was a Quantum Q6 Edge, a good chair, one she had chosen herself 3 years prior when her multiple sclerosis had progressed to a point where walking carried more risk than dignity permitted. She had adapted to it the same way she had adapted to everything in her life, with the practical, unsentimental resolve of a woman who had learned early that most obstacles were best addressed directly rather than mourned. The MS had taken her steady gait. It had given her balance episodes and fatigue that descended without warning, and fingers that did not always do what her mind instructed. But it had not taken her intelligence, her memory, her ability to read a situation, or her voice. Those, she had believed, were permanent. She had not fully accounted for Derek. Her son was 42 years old, and stood exactly 6 feet tall, with the kind of appearance that communicated constant maintenance. The dark hair parted to the same side since law school, the pressed collars, the suits that fit well without being flashy, the handshake that people always described afterward as firm. He served on the board of the Millbrook Chamber of Commerce. He coached Little League on Saturday mornings and was photographed at the fundraising dinners that appeared in the local paper every spring. When people in town spoke of him, they reached naturally for words like upstanding and reliable, and a real credit to his family. Grace had once used those words herself. She had meant them. The room she occupied now was clean. She acknowledged that without resentment because it was true. Linda changed the sheets every Sunday and kept the small attached bathroom stocked with everything Grace needed. There was a television on the wall above the dresser and a window that faced the side yard, and the dormant hydrangea bushes she had planted herself when this had been her son's house, and she had visited freely. The room was adequate in every observable, reportable way. What was not adequate was the door. 6 months ago, Derek had explained the new lock with the measured calm of someone who had prepared the explanation in advance. The lock was on the outside, he said. It was for her safety. She had experienced 2 falls in the past year, both documented, and if she attempted to navigate to the kitchen in the middle of the night without assistance and no one heard her go down, the consequences could be severe. The lock, he said, was simply a precaution. What he did not address was why she did not have a key. What he did not address was why 9 months ago her mobile phone had ceased functioning precisely 3 days after she had called her former colleague Angela Price and described quietly and specifically her concerns about certain decisions Derek appeared to be making regarding her financial accounts. What he did not address was the notary who had come to the house 4 months ago with documents described as routine estate planning simplification, and who had worked with a speed and efficiency that left Grace very little time to read what was placed in front of her, while Derek waited in the hallway, and the notary's voice maintained the smooth, pleasant tone of someone executing a process rather than facilitating a decision. Grace had spent 26 years teaching children to read carefully before they signed their names to anything. She had noticed the language in those documents. She had noticed the scope of the financial power of attorney. She had noticed that her quarterly account statements, which had arrived by mail for 30 years, had not appeared in over 8 months. She had noticed that Derek and Linda had taken 2 vacations in the past year, that the photographs on Linda's social media, visible on the hallway tablet before it was relocated to a room Grace could not reach, suggested were not inexpensive. Grace had also noticed that she was 68 years old, that her condition was degenerative, and that in this particular town her son was regarded as one of its finest citizens. She was not confused. She was not mistaken. She was, however, locked in. Outside the window, the November sky sat low and grey above the yard. The hydrangeas were bare. The lawn was the pale, stiff colour of cold grass that had stopped trying. A crow landed on the wooden fence post at the yard's edge and studied the frozen ground with the focused attention of a creature that simply needed to eat. She understood that impulse completely. From somewhere east of town, carried on the cold air through the window's thin old frame, came a sound she did not immediately place because it had been so long since she had been outside to hear things as they actually sounded. Then she placed it. Motorcycles. Not 1 or 2. A convoy. The low, rolling, unapologetic thunder of engines that did not modulate themselves for the comfort of anyone listening. She watched the crow lift from the fence and disappear above the tree line. She thought about thunder. She thought about how sometimes the thing you've been told to fear is the only thing still moving toward you. Cooper McAllister had been riding since he was 19, which meant he had been doing it for 26 years, and in that time he had developed the specific spatial awareness that long-distance riding builds in a person, a constant, near-automatic reading of pavement weather, the machines immediately around him, and the behavior of every driver within 50 feet. It was not a skill he had consciously cultivated. It was simply what happened when you spent enough hours at speed, with nothing between yourself and the road but your own judgment. He was not, despite what most people assumed when they saw him for the first time, someone you needed to be afraid of. He was 6 feet 2 inches and built the way men are built when they have spent years doing physically demanding work without caring about what it looked like. All functional mass, nothing ornamental. His forearms, visible below the rolled cuffs of his flannel shirt, were tattooed from wrist to elbow in a layered accumulation of images gathered across 2 decades. The older ones faded to blue-gray beneath the newer ones. His beard was dark with the first threads of grey appearing at the jaw. His leather vest, the one with the patch that caused certain kinds of people to go still and watchful, was soft from years of use, the leather creased in the specific patterns of a garment that had been lived in rather than worn. He had done 2 tours in Iraq with the 101st Airborne Division, 2005 and 2006. He had come home in early 2007 with permanent hearing impairment in his left ear, a preference for open spaces that he did not examine too carefully, and a clarity about what mattered and what did not that the army had drilled into him and the combat had confirmed. He had found the chapter 6 months after his discharge through a friend who had understood without being told what it meant to need a specific kind of brotherhood built on specific kinds of trust. The men he rode with, Donnie Walsh, Felix Strand, and 6 others currently spread across 2 lanes of Highway 41 in the grey midday light, were a mechanic, a retired firefighter, 2 veterans, an electrician, a contractor, and a man who taught high school history on weekdays and rode on weekends because it was the only thing that fully quieted his mind. They paid taxes and obeyed traffic laws with the specific care of people who understood that a standard traffic stop was a different experience for them than for most. They had been in Nashville for a regional gathering and were heading east toward Knoxville when Donnie's bike threw a code and they pulled off at the nearest exit, which happened to be the south end of Millbrook, Tennessee. The gas station was a BP with an attached mechanics bay, the kind of small operation that had survived the consolidation of the industry by being the only option for 15 miles in each direction. Cooper pulled in first, and the others followed, the sound of 9 motorcycles in a gas station forecourt producing the particular acoustic effect that brought the teenage boy at the front desk to the window, and then, just as immediately, caused him to take 2 careful steps back from it. "Easy," Donnie said, swinging his leg over his bike and pressing both hands into the small of his back with the grimace of a man whose spine had been registering complaints since 40. At 48, built like the community college linebacker he had briefly been, Donnie's size was the first thing anyone noticed and the last thing that told them anything useful about him. His red beard was full and his eyes were pale grey and sharp. "We're not going to eat the kid." "He doesn't know that yet," Felix said, pulling off his helmet and rolling his neck. Felix was the youngest at 38, with close-cropped hair and the kind of watchful stillness that came from growing up in a part of Memphis where reading a situation before it developed was a practical survival skill. Cooper was already walking toward the mechanics bay when the grey Volvo turned into the forecourt. It was late model, clean, the kind of car that communicated a specific income bracket without advertising it. The man at the wheel had dark hair parted to the side and wore a collared shirt even on a Sunday. The woman in the passenger seat had the rigid posture of someone executing composure rather than feeling it. Cooper registered them the way he registered everything at close range, filed and catalogued without particular attention. What he noticed next made him slow his step, then stop. In the back seat of the Volvo, positioned against the door with the contained stillness of someone who had made a practice of occupying as little space as possible, was a woman with silver hair and eyes the color of a November sky. Those eyes moved immediately and directly to Cooper's face with an intensity that did not waver or drop. She was perhaps 65, 68, pale in the way of illness rather than cold. Her hands were folded in her lap with the deliberateness of someone maintaining a posture rather than resting in one, and even from 20 feet across the forecourt he could see that her knuckles were white. The driver got out and went to the pump without once looking toward the group of motorcycles. The deliberateness of the avoidance was itself a kind of statement. The woman in the passenger seat got out, produced her phone in one smooth motion, and walked to the corner of the building with the bright, preoccupied air of someone who needed to make an important call. The woman in the back seat did not move. Cooper held his position for 3 full seconds. She was still watching him. Her expression was not the expression of someone frightened by what she saw. The fear in it was old and compressed, the kind that has been lived with long enough to be managed rather than displayed. What was present beneath that management was something else entirely, something that had identified a window and was deciding in real time whether to use it. He walked toward the mechanic's bay. He had no plan. He was going in that direction anyway, and he let his path angle slightly, naturally, toward the back of the Volvo. The pump was on the driver's side. The woman with the phone was at the corner. Cooper walked along the passenger side of the car. The window was down 2 inches. Someone had opened it partially and left it there. As Cooper came level with the rear window, the silver-haired woman turned her face directly toward that gap. He could see now that she was perhaps 68, that the wheelchair he hadn't initially noticed was folded flat in the cargo area behind her, and that she was measuring something. Measuring him, measuring the distance to the driver, measuring the noise level in the forecourt and what it would cover. She had maybe 6 seconds. He was 3 feet away, then 2. His left ear would have missed it completely. His right ear, still reliable, caught every word. "They locked me in," she said. Her voice was barely above a breath, controlled, specific, not panicked. The voice of a woman who had prepared this sentence and was delivering it with the precision of someone who knew she would not get a second attempt. The room. "They locked me in and took my phone. My name is Grace Hartwell, please." Cooper kept walking. Same pace, same angle. He did not look back, did not slow, did not alter a single visible thing about his movement until he was inside the mechanic's bay and standing before a wall of mounted tools that he looked at without seeing for 3 full seconds. Then Donnie came through the door. "O2 sensor is my guess," Donnie said, pulling on a pair of gloves. He read Cooper's face the way he had learned to read it over 7 years of riding together, which was a different and more specific skill than reading a stranger's face. And what he saw there made him stop. "Talk." "Not here," Cooper said. "Right," Donnie said quietly. "Soon, then." Through the bay window, Cooper watched the grey Volvo pull out of the forecourt without hurrying. He watched it take the ramp back toward the main road. He held the license plate in his mind, the way he had been trained to hold information that mattered. Tennessee, QLP 4471. They found a pull-off a quarter-mile from the station, in the shadow of a grain elevator that had seen better decades. And Cooper told Donnie and Felix everything, in the time it took Felix to check the weather on his phone, and Donnie to eat half a gas station sandwich. When Cooper finished, Donnie was quiet for the specific length of time that meant he was thinking rather than composing a response. "So we call the police," he said. Cooper looked at him. Donnie absorbed that look and exhaled slowly through his nose. He had known Cooper since 2008 and had developed a thorough understanding of what that particular expression meant. "We called the police, and we explained that 9 men in leather vests were at a gas station when a woman in a car whispered something through a window. And they look at us, and they see the patch," Felix said. "And they look at the car and find the man driving. It is a respected local attorney whose mother has a documented neurological condition, and they thank us for our concern and suggest we continue our journey." Donnie balled up the sandwich wrapper. "But we're still going to do something." "Yes," Cooper said. "What do we know?" "Her name is Grace Hartwell. She's in a wheelchair. It was folded in the back. She said they locked her in the room and took her phone. She said, 'Please.'" Donnie was quiet again. "She said, 'Please,'" he repeated. "She did." Felix already had his phone out. In 40 minutes, using public records, archived local news, and the kind of methodical internet searching that anyone with patience could do, they had assembled a picture. Grace Marie Hartwell, born 1957, retired educator, 26 years at Millbrook Elementary, noted in local news archives as recently as 2019 for her volunteer work at the county library. Her name appeared on property records as the owner of a house on Birchwood Lane. Her house, the one she'd presumably lived in before. The address connected to Derek Hartwell, attorney at law, was on Elm Ridge Road. "She's living at her son's address," Felix said, "not her own." "And she hasn't been in the news since 2019, Donnie noted. Cooper drove to the Millbrook Sheriff's Department alone, on foot from the gas station, leaving his vest with Donnie, a calculated decision that cost him something specific and personal, but that he had made before and knew how to execute. Without the vest, he was a large man in flannel and jeans. With it, the conversation was over before it began. The deputy at the front desk was a young woman who listened to Cooper with the careful neutrality of trained professional attention and asked him to wait. He waited 22 minutes, watching a wall-mounted television cycling through local news with the sound off. Then Sheriff Ray Boone came through the interior door, a broad man of 55, with the easy authority of someone who had run this department for a long time and intended to keep running it for considerably longer. He shook Cooper's hand. He listened to what Cooper said with the attentive patience of a man who had made a career out of listening to things he'd already decided how to respond to. He asked, with genuine and seamless politeness, which chapter Cooper rode with. He asked whether Cooper had consumed any alcohol that afternoon. He mentioned that Derek Hartwell was a well-regarded member of the community who had made significant personal sacrifices to ensure his mother received proper care following her diagnosis. He mentioned that Grace Hartwell's condition sometimes affected her perception of circumstances, and that Derek had been very open with the community about the challenges the family was managing together. He mentioned that arriving in a small town and making allegations against a prominent local family based on a few words heard at a gas station was exactly the kind of thing that created complications for everyone. He mentioned, with the same courteous firmness, that he appreciated Cooper bringing this to their attention. Cooper thanked him and walked out. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold afternoon air and breathed steadily and thought about Grace Hartwell's eyes through the gap in that car window. Not confused, not unfocused, not the eyes of a woman whose perception of circumstances had been compromised by her illness, precisely, entirely, specifically clear. He walked back. "Well," Felix asked. "We need Angela Price," Cooper said. "Who is Angela Price?" Cooper held out his hand for the phone. It took 50 minutes to find her. The former home health aide, whose connection to Grace he had inferred from a single line in a community Facebook post where she had mentioned missing certain former clients. The comment was 8 months old. Her name appeared on the registration of a licensed home health agency in the greater Knoxville area. Cooper called the agency's main line, explained that he was attempting to reach Angela Price regarding a client he believed she had previously cared for, and provided his full name and callback number. He asked them to have her call as soon as possible. She called back in 19 minutes. When Cooper explained who he was and what had happened at the gas station, there was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough for him to check the signal bars on Felix's phone. Then Angela Price said, "I filed a report with Adult Protective Services 8 months ago. I was told it was under review. I haven't heard a single word since." She talked for 28 minutes. She described the last months of her time as Grace's caregiver, the growing unease, the specific conversation with Grace about the accounts and the power of attorney, and the feeling that important decisions were being made too quickly and with too little room for Grace's own questions. She described the phone call she'd received from Derek the day after that conversation, informing her that her services were no longer needed and that the family had made alternative arrangements. She described the letter. "She gave it to me the last time I saw her," Angela said, "handwritten, 4 pages. She told me she was concerned about what Derek might do if he found out she'd spoken to me, and she wanted there to be a written record of everything she had observed and everything she was worried about. She asked me to keep it somewhere safe." A pause. I've kept it in a fireproof box in my closet for 8 months. Can we see it? Cooper asked. I've been waiting, Angela said quietly, for someone to ask me that question. They met her at a diner on the highway at 7 that evening. She arrived with a manila envelope and sat across from Cooper and Donnie and Felix without visible hesitation. The calm, level-eyed composure of someone whose profession had long since taught her that size and appearance were poor indicators of character. She slid the envelope across the table. The letter was exactly 4 pages, written in the neat, deliberate hand of a woman who had spent decades writing on chalkboards for children in the back rows. Cooper read it twice. When he looked up, Angela was watching him with the particular attention of someone waiting to find out whether the person across from them is actually going to do something. "Tomorrow morning," Cooper said, "we go to the house." They drove past the house on Elm Ridge Road twice in the early evening, slowly and without stopping, in the particular way of men who needed to understand a space before they entered it. Cooper counted windows and noted which rooms showed light. Donnie identified the camera mounted above the front door and a second one at the garage corner. Felix observed that the grey Volvo was presumably in the closed, attached garage, and that the house's setback from the road would make any conversation at the front door visible from the street, but not audible. They did not discuss what they were doing as reconnaissance. They simply did it, because it was the sensible thing to do before walking toward a situation with variables you hadn't controlled. Back at the motel they'd taken on the edge of town, Cooper lay on top of the covers and read Grace's letter a third time. The handwriting was steady throughout, not the handwriting of a woman whose cognition was compromised, but the precise schoolteacher's script of someone choosing her words carefully because she understood that the words might need to function as evidence. She described dates and figures. She described the specific language in the power of attorney documents and why it had alarmed her. She described the pattern of account statements ceasing, of the phone malfunction following the call to Angela, of the notary's visit and the speed at which the signing had proceeded. She described the lock on her door and when it had appeared and what Derek had said about it and what he had not said. She described the walker placed on the high shelf. That detail lodged in Cooper's mind and stayed there through the night. They drove to Elm Ridge Road at 9 the following morning. The choice of a Tuesday was not arbitrary. Derek had a law practice downtown with a full client schedule, and Linda's real estate office had public hours starting at 9. Angela had confirmed from public records that neither appeared to work from home. If the timing was right, Grace would have only Linda in the house, and Linda's schedule would pull her out within the hour. They were not counting on that. They were simply noting it as a probability. Cooper knocked. The pause that followed was long enough to suggest that whoever was inside was deciding something. Then the sound of movement, a door somewhere down the hallway, and footsteps approaching. Linda Hartwell opened the front door. She was 39 and had the carefully assembled appearance of a woman who put consistent thought into how she presented herself, including apparently on Tuesday mornings at home. Her dark blonde hair was neat. Her posture was straight. When she saw Cooper, and then Donnie, and then Angela, and then Felix and 2 others behind him, the assembled quality did not break. She was, Cooper recognized with a specific kind of professional attention, very practiced at surfaces. "Can I help you?" The voice was pleasant and exactly calibrated. "I'm here to see Grace Hartwell," Cooper said. Linda's eyes moved over the group. "Mrs. Hartwell isn't available for visitors at the moment. If you'd like to leave your name, my name is Cooper McAllister." He said it the way he'd learned to say his name in situations that required clarity without aggression, factual, unrushed, taking up exactly the space it needed. "I'm here with Angela Price, who is a licensed home health professional and former caregiver to Mrs. Hartwell. We have a written document signed by Grace Hartwell requesting access to a health professional of her choosing. If you'd prefer, we can have Adult Protective Services conduct a formal welfare check. That process takes longer and involves more people. This way is simpler. Not one word of that was legally binding. Cooper was aware of that. He was also aware that the precise, specific quality of the statement and the presence of a licensed professional with documented credentials was a different kind of weight than the law, particularly on someone who had built her life around the management of appearances. Linda took out her phone. "I need to call my husband." "That's your right," Cooper said. "We'll wait here." The call lasted 4 minutes. Cooper listened to the half he could hear. "Unreasonable. She's not alone. I don't know what they want, Derek. What should I do?" And watched the small changes in Linda's posture as her husband spoke. The instructions came in the pause that lasted nearly 40 seconds. When she ended the call, something had shifted in her bearing. The surface was still there. Beneath it, a calculation had been made. "Come in," she said. "I'll take you to see her." The interior of the house was what Cooper had expected from the exterior. Well furnished, recently updated, the home of people who spent money with ease. The kitchen had the polished surfaces and restaurant-quality appliances of a renovation completed in the past 2 years. The art on the walls was not cheap. They walked down a carpeted hallway, past a closed office door, past a bathroom, past a linen closet, to a door at the end. Linda produced a key from the pocket of her cardigan. Cooper watched the key. He watched her hand. He watched the lock, a key on the outside of a residential interior door. She opened it and stepped aside. The room was clean. That was true, and Cooper registered it as true. It was adequate in every surface way. The television, the window, the made bed, the neatly arranged dresser. Anyone conducting a brief, unannounced inspection and stopping at the surface would have found nothing obviously wrong. Cooper did not stop at the surface. Grace Hartwell sat in her wheelchair near the window. Her back was straight and her hands were in her lap, and her blue eyes went immediately to Cooper's face with the same quality of directness they'd had through the car window. Recognition, not surprise. And beneath the recognition, a compressed, enormous thing that she was managing with the discipline of someone who had been managing it for a long time. She held herself still while Linda was in the room. That itself told him something. Angela was already moving. She crossed the room in 6 steps, crouched beside Grace's wheelchair, and took Grace's hands in both of hers. "I got your letter," Angela said. Her voice was level and warm. "I kept it safe, the way you asked." Grace closed her eyes. She held them closed for 3 seconds, 4. When she opened them again, something that had been held behind her face for a very long time came forward. It was relief. But not the small, immediate relief of a short-term problem resolved. It was the enormous, terrifying relief of someone who has lived for a sustained period in the specific fear that help would never come, and who is now, in this moment, discovering they were wrong. "I didn't think anyone would come," Grace said. Her voice was steady and clear. Her hands in Angela's were shaking. "We came," Cooper said. From the hallway, he could hear Linda's voice. She was on the phone with Derek again, the composure fully gone now, her voice tight and clipped. Donnie had positioned himself in the hall in the easy, uncomplicated way of a large man who understood the utility of occupying space. The 2 others had remained at the front of the house. Angela was conducting her professional assessment, noting Grace's current medications on a small pad she'd produced from her bag. Grace was answering her questions with the precise recall of someone whose mind was entirely clear. Cooper moved through the room with deliberate slowness, giving it his full attention. He saw the medication whiteboard on the wall beside the television. Cheerful green marker, neatly formatted, the kind of thing that would read at a glance as attentive caregiving. He read it twice. He identified the sleep medication prescribed by Grace's neurologist, appearing on the twice-daily schedule. He saw the corner of the room, the high shelf mounted 5.5 feet up the wall, holding the folded walker. He looked at that shelf for a long moment. 5.5 feet from the floor. Grace's reach, from her chair, might cover 4. Felix, who had remained quiet since entering the house, had his phone to his ear in the hallway. Cooper caught the specific, even tone Felix used when he needed to convey information with zero room for misinterpretation. The tone of a man from Memphis who had learned to be heard without being loud. He was giving someone a tracking number, the tracking number from Angela's original APS complaint. Derek Hartwell arrived at the house at 10:47. Cooper heard the garage door, then the interior door, then footsteps that were moving quickly but not running, because Derek Hartwell was a man who understood the optics of running. He came into the hallway and looked at Donnie, and then looked past Donnie into the room where Cooper stood, and his face ran through several expressions before landing on authority. "You are on my property without my permission," Derek said. "You need to leave immediately." Cooper looked at him. He took a moment with it, the way he'd learned to take a moment with things that required precision. Derek Hartwell was a composed man. The composure was fraying at the edges in a way that was visible if you knew what to look for. "Your mother has the right to see a licensed home health professional," Cooper said. "She has the right to have her current medication administration reviewed. She has the right to a door in her own living space that she can open from the inside." He paused. "The Adult Protective Services caseworker is on her way. You're welcome to ask us to leave when she arrives." The APS caseworker was Pamela Oates, 51 years old, 19 years in the field. She arrived at 11:15 with the quiet efficiency of a person who has long since stopped being surprised by the settings in which she encounters the things she encounters. She interviewed Grace alone for 37 minutes. When she came out, she made 3 phone calls in sequence, stepping into the hallway each time and speaking in the low, level voice of someone conveying information that required follow-up. After the 3rd call, she spoke briefly with Derek. His face, by then, was the face of a man watching the architecture of a long and careful construction beginning to bear the wrong kind of weight. Sheriff Ray Boone arrived at 12:30. He did not look at Cooper when he came through the door. Cooper did not require him to. The forensic accountant from the state's Adult Protective Services Financial Exploitation Unit arrived the following Thursday. She was a compact, methodical woman of 44 named Sandra Voss, who had spent 15 years examining the financial residue of human cruelty and had developed the specific detachment of someone who needed that detachment to do the work without being consumed by it. What she found in Derek Hartwell's records was not, she later told the investigator, unusual in kind. In degree, however, it was substantial. Over 22 months, transfers had moved funds from 3 of Grace's accounts, a retirement portfolio accumulated over a 30-year teaching career, a savings account she had maintained since her 30s, and the proceeds of a life insurance policy that had matured following her husband's death 4 years prior, into accounts bearing Derek's name, Linda's name, and 2 holding companies registered in Delaware under names that had no apparent connection to either of them. The total, when Sandra Voss compiled it, was enough to represent the difference between security and vulnerability for a 68-year-old woman with a degenerative condition and a finite earning horizon, which was, of course, the precise calculation that had made Grace Hartwell a viable target in the first place. The power of attorney had been executed in circumstances that Grace's letter and Angela's professional testimony described with sufficient specificity to raise serious legal questions about whether it met the standard of informed and uncoerced consent. Derek was a family attorney, not an estate specialist. The particular vulnerabilities of the document he had prepared were the kind that a specialist would have avoided and that a generalist, hurrying toward a goal, might not have recognized as vulnerabilities at all. He was arrested on a Thursday morning, 14 days after Cooper McAllister had stood in a gas station forecourt and heard a whisper through a 2-inch gap in a car window. Linda was arrested the following Monday. The town of Millbrook, Tennessee, had a collective response that could best be described as the specific discomfort of a community discovering that the surfaces it had maintained with such care had not been telling the whole story. The local paper ran the story twice. The second article was longer and included quotes from former colleagues of Grace's at the elementary school who described her as one of the clearest-minded and most principled people they had ever known. No one who had been quoted describing Derek as upstanding and reliable was quoted in the article about his arrest. That absence was its own kind of statement. Grace Hartwell was transferred to a skilled nursing and rehabilitation facility of her own choosing, one she had researched herself on Angela's tablet during the week between the APS investigation's opening and Derek's arrest, reading the reviews with the methodical thoroughness of a woman who had spent 26 years evaluating information before making decisions. The facility was 40 minutes east of Millbrook, in a town with a good regional medical center and a population small enough to maintain the quality of personal attention she had always valued. Her room had a window that faced a garden. The door had no lock on the outside. Angela Price resumed her role as Grace's primary home health liaison, driving the 40 minutes twice a week. On those visits, they drank tea and talked about books and the garden and occasionally about what the previous 2 years had felt like from the inside, the way people who have come through something serious together sometimes need to speak about it directly in order to set it properly in the past. Grace's physical therapist noted at their 6-week assessment that Grace was making faster progress than her chart's baseline suggested. He attributed it, in his clinical notes, to patient motivation. What he was observing, though he lacked the full context to understand it precisely, was what happens to a person's body when it is no longer spending the majority of its energy on sustained, suppressed fear. Cooper came back on a Saturday in late January. He came alone, in the truck he used when the roads were uncertain, without the vest because the vest was for the road, and this was something else. The facility had visiting hours from 10 to 4, and he arrived at 11 and gave his full name at the front desk and filled out the visitor form, while the woman behind it looked at him with the careful neutrality of someone recalibrating an assumption in real time. Grace was in a common room near a window that overlooked the garden, reading. The room had 4 other people in it and a soft ambient sound from the television in the corner, and when Cooper walked in, she looked up from her page, and her expression did something he hadn't seen in the 2 previous times he'd been in her presence. She simply looked like herself. Not managed, not compressed, not braced. Herself. "I wondered if you'd come," she said. "I said I would." Cooper pulled the chair across from her and sat. "You didn't say that," she said, with the precise recall of a woman who had spent decades listening carefully to what children said and what they meant. "You said your job was to get there. You didn't say anything about coming back." "I meant to come back," he said. She set the book down and considered him. Outside the window, the January garden was bare, but arranged. The beds dormant under their winter mulch, the stone path clean, everything at rest rather than dead. "They wrote about it," she said. "The local paper, online. I saw it. The comments were interesting." There was a dry quality in her voice that told him everything about who she had been in front of a classroom for 26 years. Some people were grateful. Some people said it was surprising. Some people said, she paused, that they didn't know what to make of it. The patch and the doing the right thing, they couldn't seem to fit those 2 things into the same picture. "Most people can't," Cooper said. "They kept using the word unlikely," Grace said, "unlikely heroes, as though the most important thing about it was that they hadn't expected it from you." Cooper was quiet. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "At the gas station, when you walked past the car," she held his gaze directly, "were you ever close to just walking away? Before you heard me? Was there a moment?" He thought about the question with the care it deserved. He thought about the angle of his approach to the car, the automatic cataloguing that had made him slow his step, The specific quality of her stillness that had registered in a part of his attention trained for exactly that kind of recognition. "No," he said. "I wasn't close." "Why not?" He thought about the ways to answer that. The training, the instinct, the particular attunement that combat had built in him at a level below conscious decision. He thought about Donnie, who had heard what Cooper described at the grain elevator pull-off and not once asked whether they were sure. He thought about Felix, who had made the APS call with the calm of someone who had identified the correct action and executed it. "We don't leave people behind," he said. "That's the whole thing, really." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. "I was a teacher for 26 years, she said. "I thought I was reasonably good at reading people, at knowing which children were going to grow into people who helped others and which ones were going to cause harm." She paused. "I was entirely wrong about Derek. I raised him. I shaped him in the years when character is formed, and I got it completely wrong." Another pause, and in it something honest and unsentimental. "I've been thinking about what that means, what I was teaching myself about judgment while I was teaching them." "You made the right call at the gas station," Cooper said. "I made the only call available to me in 6 seconds with no better options," she said. "There's a difference." Her blue eyes were steady. "I had no way to know who you were, no way to know if you'd help or laugh or tell Derek what I'd said. I was going on nothing but the fact that you were there and that you slowed down." She paused. "I chose to see a person before I saw a patch." Cooper looked at her. "Maybe we both had to break something," Grace said, "to be able to do what we did." He drove back west on Highway 41 in the late afternoon, the January sun coming in low from the side and throwing long pale shadows across the fields. The road was familiar now, in the way that a road becomes familiar when something significant happened on it. Not identical to itself anymore, carrying the weight of the event the way certain streets in certain cities carry the weight of history without marking it. He thought about the deputy who had listened, about Boone, who had eventually come, about Pamela Oates, 19 years in, doing her job with the thoroughness it required, about Angela Price, who had kept a letter in a fireproof box for 8 months because she had known a woman who deserved to have her words preserved. He thought about Derek Hartwell, who had served on boards and coached Little League and maintained a handshake that people described as firm, and who had looked at his own mother, at everything she had spent 68 years building, and seen a resource. He thought about the other direction of it, about the people at the gas station who had seen 9 motorcycles pull in and made their assessments immediately and completely, about the sheriff who had looked at Cooper's flannel shirt and done the math and arrived at his conclusion before the sentence was finished, about the comment sections that couldn't fit the patch and the right thing into the same picture. He thought about how much of human harm was made possible by the stories people told themselves about who was capable of what. How the man with the firm handshake and the community board seat was incapable of cruelty. How the man with the leather vest and the tattooed forearms was incapable of decency. How those stories, maintained with enough consistency and enough social reinforcement, became the walls of rooms people were locked inside. He drove until the highway curved east and the late light came from behind him, pushing his shadow out long and thin on the road ahead. Somewhere west of Millbrook, he passed the gas station on the south end of town. The BP sign was lit against the fading afternoon. He drove past it without slowing and did not look back. Some doors once opened you didn't need to revisit. You just kept moving forward.